Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to the December webinar of the International Iranian Economic Association. I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar. My name is Nadereh Chamlou, and I am a board member of IIEA, a great fan of IIEA, as well as a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. I would very much like to urge you to sign up for these webinars, as well as become a member of IIEA, because we would like very much to increase our membership and to broaden and deepen our community so that we can be much more up to date and, of course, as widely covered as possible about Iranian economic issues, bringing together Iranian economists as well as economists from elsewhere who are interested in Iranian economic matters. This is our the last webinar for this year, for 2024. We have two papers today which were selected by the IIEA scientific committee for our planned Doha conference, which we had to postpone, and we decided to offer them instead through our webinars. So I am very happy to be chairing this session. It's a topic that is very close to my heart, as many of you know. It's about women's economic participation and the factors that affect it up or down. And I have two outstanding speakers, outstanding researchers who will join me today. Of course, many of them don't, both of them don't need any introduction, but let me just give a very brief intro of the first speaker, Professor Djavad Salehi-Isfahani, a dear and long-term friend, who is, I think, an icon in this field, particularly in the field of women's participation and gender issues that are affected by economics, as well as gender issues that affect economic performance. He is a graduate of Harvard University. He did his PhD at Harvard University and is currently a professor of economics at Virginia Tech in Blacksburg. His bio is all over the internet, so I won't take any more time to spend on it. And our second speaker is Ebadi, and who is currently an economist at the World Bank. He did his master's. He did his undergraduate and master's studies at the University of Tehran, and then a master's at London School of Economics, and a PhD in economics from George Washington University, and is currently active at the World Bank. So with that, I would like to give the floor to Djavad for his presentation on how COVID impacted women's labor force participation rates, and we will come back to the second paper. Djavad, you have about 20 minutes, and please, and for those who want to send in questions, please please send them in, so we would have a good pipeline of questions by the time that we come to the Q&A session. Thank you so much, and Djavad, over to you.
Good morning from Blacksburg. I'm going to share my screen now, and let me know if it's working. Are you seeing the larger screen or the?
Yes.
Good. Well, thank you very much for this invitation. Of course, I was expecting to be presenting this in person in Doha, which would have been more exciting, but given the circumstances, I should say deteriorating circumstances in the Middle East, this is a very welcome second best. I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Haiyan Dong of the World Bank and Minh Do of Vietnam National University. and also acknowledge support from the MENA Chief Economist's Office of the World Bank, who helped financially, but also with reviewing the work in the past. This paper is now a working paper of the World Bank in the World Bank series. And I'm going to present most of the results from there, but also adding a little bit of the work I have had time to do since we finished the paper. I'll talk about an important issue, I think, which is women's employment under the pandemic. We know that women's labor force participation in Iran is very low, and the pandemic opens a kind of a window to see what is going on, because sometimes when a pattern is continuing, it's hard to explain it, it's hard to understand it, but when you get an external shock, you have a chance to see something about the foundation of that phenomena. We will be looking at the timing and the intensity of the pandemic shock, and the evidence comes mainly from the repeated cross-sections, as in the paper that you may have seen, but I will add a few slides from panel data. Globally, the pandemic affected employment and affected the gender gap of employment. It affected women's employment more seriously and negatively than men's. COVID forced a shift away from market work towards home production, which by its nature imposes a greater burden on women. The gender gap in employment returned to pre-pandemic levels in most countries, in India and in Uganda after a few months or quarters in Uganda. But in Iran, it appears to have lasted several years. And in fact, the latest data does not show that it has ended. We are still below. We don't know below what really. I will be emphasizing the gap relative to 2019 before the pandemic. But as you will see, there has been changes in the labor force participation rate of women over time. So we don't know what is the norm to tell exactly whether we are below that norm or not. As you know, Iran's experience has been very similar to the rest of the world in that women's employment declined more steeply than men's and has persisted for 3 years on. This result is already apparent in a paper, 2022 paper by Yousefi and Farajnia. COVID hit Iran earlier and harder than neighboring countries, and lockdowns were rare. So there's some differences between the experience of Iran and other countries, specifically in Vietnam, that my co-authors have studied. Their lockdowns were the primary mechanism by which COVID affected employment. In Iran, it was, we believe it was, lockdowns were rare, so it was the intensity of the pandemic and the risk of catching COVID that kept people at home. The data will come from Iran's labor force surveys, which are available 2005 through 2023, in fact, though we end in 2022 for most of the slides that you will see. These data are available, thankfully, in unit record. They're nationally representative and include demographic and labor force, labor market information for close to 500,000 individuals annually. So it's a very rich data set. And we use quarterly data to pin down the impact of COVID. The specific quarter when the gender gap in employment widened. I will supplement this longitudinal data with panel data constructed from the rotating surveys for 2019, 2020, which is the year of COVID's arrival. This is a graph that's perhaps tells 90% of the story. You will see a lot of other slides, but if you take one thing away from this talk, it should be this slide. On the left, you see results from the longitudinal data from 2005, Q1, all the way to the timing of sanction. And this is what I was talking about. There's up and down in this labor force participation rate of women, which, by the way, is much lower than men's. This is a phenomenon that kind of defines Iran's labor market to a large extent. You don't see this gap, such a large gap in other Muslim countries, certainly not in Malaysia, for example, and nor in Tunisia or Egypt. And you also see here, when COVID hits, there is a decline in participation rate for both men and women. Women's is more pronounced. But to get a better picture of what's going on, we kind of zoom in on these COVID quarters. Compared to 2019, before COVID hit, we see that men's participation rate continued pretty much as before, a bit lower, but not drastically. It is women's participation that declines drastically, falling first by 15% and then eventually by 20% 2 years later. And as you can see, it hasn't really recovered. There is some recovery here, but then it goes down again after 2023. This is looking at the latest data. And what is interesting here is that the economy is kind of growing through these years. And so you can't blame lack of demand for labor for the lack of full recovery to the 0 point. What complicates Iran's story is the existence of other shocks, like the Trump's maximum pressure sanctions shock that started 2 years before the pandemic in May 2018, but it lasted into the COVID period. So it can be a confounding factor. Luckily, its nature is different from the pandemic shock. Trump's sanctions were primarily a negative income shock. And this may have increased employment and narrowed the gender gap in employment as more women joined the labor force to supplement lower income of men. We don't know this, but it is important to keep in mind that the pandemic had a negative effect on women's work directly, because it shifted living from outdoors to indoors, and women were the primary caretaker at home, so they bore the brunt of the shock from sanctions, from the pandemic. And we use a measure of the intensity of the pandemic, defined by excess deaths over normal deaths by province, which helps identify the impact of COVID, because this variation across provinces is not what you would expect from sanctions. Some background information on gender and employment in Iran. Many of you already know these things, but very quickly, women's labor market participation was very low to begin with, about 1/5 of men. Women are generally engaged in home production and men in market work. So there's this kind of division, classic division of labor based on gender. And women's work is often supplemental to men, and it is kind of insurance against the loss of breadwinner employment. And that is probably what we are seeing in the graph that I just showed you. And we do know that marital status and education affect participation and employment. I'll have some graphs for that. This is the marital status story. If you look at the women's participation rate over the years, you find that single women, unmarried women, the orange line, and the green line, divorced women, have a very similar pattern of participation. And it actually, their participation increased after 2014. These are bad years, if you like, when there's sanctions are intensifying, the first round of sanctions. And it gives some credence to the fact that sanctions may have increased participation of women. And if you look at the married and widowed women, they have a very different pattern. Their participation is about half, less than half of single women. So marriage plays a very big role in participation. And widows are a small category, but they look, their pattern looks very similar to married women. If you look at the gender gap between men and women in participation based on marriage, you see also here that a lot of the difference that we see as a gender gap in the participation is between married men and women on the right side of this panel. If you limit the sample to single men and women, you find that the participation rates are closer to each other, but still about half, not 1/5. So what is the method of identification? As I mentioned, the confounding factor is Trump sanctions, which hit Iran spring, summer of 2018 and had lingering effects. So we need a variation across provinces that is related to COVID. Since we do not have systematic lockdown information, we use the variation in excess death rates. So we have quarterly death rates by province going back to 2015. We use the pre-pandemic years to estimate what province level death rates should have been after COVID came. And the difference between the expected and the actual, we call excess death rates. And we use that to define intensity of the pandemic or intensity of the treatment, if you like. Our method is generally difference in difference. We use a lot of interactions to get at the variation in pandemic intensity over time and between provinces, which helps, we believe helps identify the impact of COVID. The paper I mentioned before by Yousefi and Parashnia does a good job of identifying the quarter in which COVID hits and its impact on labor force participation of men and women, but it does not identify COVID's effect because it is only using time, the time dimension, which could be affected by these confounding factors. It's the variation across provinces, I think, which is the innovation in this paper. And there is, in fact, quite a bit of regional variation in the timing of COVID, which is interesting. If you look at this top left graph, this is for Iran as a whole. You see in 2020, quarter three, we have peak of excess deaths, which then goes down, but picks up again. Tehran's province looks very much like Iran as a whole, but other provinces, notably Gilan, you may recall that the Tehranis who then fled to the north to get away from COVID brought COVID to Gilan very quickly. And so it has a peak earlier than the rest of the country. In fact, earlier than Mazandaran and Markazi. These are places where COVID came first, but then the manifestation in terms of deaths was much larger in Gilan, followed by East Azerbaijan. This is the story of COVID in Iran in terms of the national deaths per million. That's taken from our World in data. COVID arrived in late February, so this timing is really important. We are comparing quarter one of 2020, or maybe quarters after that, with the last quarter of 2019, for example. Death climbed in spring 2020, which is 2020 Q2, because I'm using Gregorian calendars, and they peaked after that several times. That is a characteristic of COVID. It would hit, and then it would subside, and then go back up again. Vaccination is part of the story. We don't use it in the analysis, but you probably know that Iran had difficulty buying vaccines at the beginning. It's not clear what it was the reason, was it sanctions or voluntary. But eventually Iran, which is this green line, picks up and matches Saudi vaccination rate, even above Turkey. But this delay, waiting about a year to get vaccination, contributed to the intensity of the pandemic. If you look at the impact of COVID through this panel data, which I said I'm supplementing for this talk, I define something called exit rate for men and women. And you see here that the exit rate is much larger for women in fall of 2020. This is 2 quarters after COVID has hit, because the panel data only is observable for specific quarters. The nature of the rotation is like that. And then in winter 2021, still 36 hours fewer. 36 hours is the average, is a decline in the hours, and for men it's about 5 hours. So that's a significant gap. And in terms of entry, you see the reverse. There's always entry into the labor market, and men's is 24%, women's 5%. So there's a reverse in terms of the percentage change in labor market status from the year before. And these are the panel observations of about 50,000 individuals. So I would say they're quite reliable. And this is a quick look at how this exit rates changed by sector. And you see that hotel and restaurants, where the COVID had a larger effect, affected women's, which is the orange lines, more than men's, which are the blue lines. So there was variation across sectors as well. If you look at the women with the school-age children, you see that initially this red line, the one with the school children, the ones that had kids and therefore had to stay home to take care of the kids, experienced a larger drop in labor force participation initially. Later on, the unmarried, those without kids also dropped out to match the decline of those with kids. And that's interesting. We don't explore why that happens, but it's something important to look at. If you look at changes in labor force participation by education, which we control for in the regressions, you will see something very interesting, that women's participation rate, the educated, those with university, was initially pretty close to men's, maybe 20 percentage point gap in 2005. And then it declines. We don't know why, probably because oil income made women's work less necessary. And then when sanctions hit, women's university-educated women's participation goes up, and then comes down later. And participation rate of those with lower education is much lower for women than it is for men. Looking a quick look at hours worked, you see the hours worked for men and women didn't change very much. Those who stayed in the labor market worked pretty much similar hours, but fewer, 5 hours, 6 hours fewer, but not a big gap between men and women, and the gap was pretty small in winter 2021. So it's employment and participation rates that are more sensitive to COVID rather than the hours. This is the regression equation that we estimate. There's a lot of interactions in it. I'm just putting two of the equations, one without the excess death rates. So this is what, for example, Yousefi and Farajnia run. And I want to focus more on the one where we have the excess deaths variable included as part of an interaction. For easier interpretation, we estimate in the paper all the equations using ordinary least squares, the so-called linear probability model. I am showing some results here based on logit as well, which are not that different and therefore probably not worth the increased cost of interpretation. If we graph the coefficient of this variable, female times quarter times excess death rate, which is the identifying variable for the impact of COVID, we see that it's significant and negative for all these quarters. This is 0 here, this is 4%, this is 6%, and more than 10%. Rather than looking at all the coefficients in a long table, I thought I'd just graph them here for you to see. These are the logit results. Again, all of these coefficients, it's the marginal effects that are really meaningful, but these are the ones I've highlighted, all of them, starting with year 2020, quarter one. Well, quarter two is when COVID hit. So you see here, this negative increases and significant, and then increases over time. Even in 2021, the departure separation from the labor market becomes larger for women relative to men. This variable is capturing the effect on the gap, not on women alone. If you want to look at the panel data, which is not in the paper, very quickly, since I am running out of time, the panel is individuals first observed in fall 2019, which is before COVID, and then in winter 2020 when pandemic is present, and then again in fall 2020 and winter 2021. So it has this constructed panel data has a good coverage of before and after, and we estimate exit rates from the labor force and job separation rates to study their determinants. And these are preliminary logit results, and dependent variable is the exit rate, which means a person was in the labor force in 2019, but was out of labor force in 2020, and I'm restricting the sample here to married individuals. You see here the impact of being older, the age group 35 to 44, and then 45 to 54, the impact increases for women. The impact, negative impact, is also there for men, but it's not significant. Initially, it is larger for men than women, but it's positive and very large. So men are the exit, they're actually rejoining the labor market. The way this variable is defined, this negative means they are leaving. And university educated is thus, these are preliminary results, so I have to really think about what they mean. I thought I'll just put that up. The main findings are, therefore, this is the last slide. Iranian women were more negatively affected by the pandemic than men. The negative impact persisted longer than other countries. Our results are descriptive. Although we believe we identify COVID as the source, we cannot tell why this negative impact has persisted so long in Iran. I think it's a very important question to investigate. It is sanctions, the weakening economy, or is it something about the nature of the labor market for women that once you exit, you cannot enter back? Could be a kind of discrimination. And finally, the impact of the pandemic was stronger on the less educated and women with school-aged children. I'll stop here. Thank you very much for listening and look forward to your comments.
Thank you so much. I think we already have one question. It's by Babak Jahanshah. He says, question for Professor Salehi. Could the impact of sanctions alongside COVID-19 vary across provinces, for example? If some are more industry intensive, would this pose a threat to the identification assumptions required for the difference in difference method? Additionally, how do they define the identification assumptions for the difference in difference method in this specific context? Very technical question.
Yes, it's a very good question. The only way the variation across provinces as a result of sanctions would interfere with what we are doing would be somehow if provinces that had industries that were prone to negative impact from sanctions happened to be the ones that also had greater intensity of the pandemic. And I doubt that very much. There is no reason to suppose, for example, that the quick entry of Gilan in the COVID situation had anything to do with its industrial structure. Well, it had something to do with the fact that it had tourism and people went there, but I don't think sanctions affected that. Or if they did, the sanctions had the lowest impact on internal tourism in Iran. So to answer that question, really, one would have to construct another province level instrument, like the nature of industries at the province level. I believe someone has done, I can't remember who, that would help you identify the impact of sanctions. But that's a very good question.
I have actually, I wrote a blog, of course, nothing as scientific as you've done about on this topic. And I just looked at 1 year, essentially the 2020, the year where the kind of the pandemic hit very, I would say, very strongly. And if I can share this and see whether that kind of, kind of coincides with what you have found. Let me see whether I can share this. This is essentially based on the. Can you see me? Can you see it?
I am not seeing it yet. Maybe because I am in full screen mode myself.
Yeah, now we can see.
Yeah.
Yes,
now so this is essentially different, not the difference in difference type of thing that what you're doing, but I checked the job losses according to the Iranian Markaz Amar, and this is the way that it looked, the 2020 job losses for men and women. And it seemed this part is quite interesting, that while women lost a lot in industry, men gained in industry. The numbers were almost 1-to-1. It was almost as if when the women left, the men were coming in. Now, the question is whether that was voluntary departure or whether it was really kind of, maybe they thought that since men are the breadwinners, they should be given the jobs. But this was the image of the job losses. Of course, both men and women lost jobs in both in agriculture and in services, men more in services than women. But the industry section, the industry job losses were actually quite interesting for that 1 year. Again, I don't know whether it was sort of like reversed afterwards, but I just was wondering whether you had there was any kind of anything to be read between these two in your findings.
Well, it exposes the weakness of our paper, which doesn't look at industry. I think this is a very important thing to bring in because the impact of the COVID, as you saw in one of the slides I had, was heterogeneous across industries. And what you're doing, I think, is very important, highlighting how this gender gap differed by sector. We throw all the sectors together and looking at the overall. So I would say the results are consistent, and it calls for us looking more carefully at the sector effect or the effect of COVID by sector, which we haven't done.
I see. I want to ask Kamya, would you like to ask to have people who have asked questions to pose their questions themselves, or should I read the questions?
I'm very happy to bring them online if you want, Nadereh. But also, I wonder whether we should do Ebads first and then have the questions in the end. Otherwise, I don't know what you think.
Well, let's just cover these two. So okay. As long as the memory of the paper or of the presentation is fresh, and then we can move to the these two questions, and then we can move to Ebad's paper.
Okay, excellent. So do you want me to promote participants to speak?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll do that.
Yes.
I don't think I need to say it. It's already written it. I just wanted to know, is it a standard placebo exercise? I'm asking what happens if you did the same thing pre-COVID, but use excess data still interacting with all these variables?
Yes, as a very good
effect. You shouldn't get any effects, right?
Yeah, good question, Hashem. And I don't remember having done it. It's certainly not in the paper, but it's a good reminder that we do need to do some sensitivity check by doing this placebo thing. I am pretty sure that we'll be picking up some variation because, as you see in the other graphs, that the female labor force participation is changing from year to year. If you do these interactions, but there was no real excess deaths before that, so I don't know if that's a good placebo. But
I mean, but excess that can be defined relative to average. I mean, there are always that measure. It may be random, right? I mean, if suppose the excess that was pure random, then you shouldn't see anything, because if you interacted with anything, it still would be random. So
that's right. Yeah. I'm sorry that we don't have that, but I think it's a very good suggestion that would be
just a suggestion.
Yes, very good suggestion. That would enhance the results.
Thank you.
And Mr. Tabrizi, if you would like to please ask a question.
Sure. Djavad, it is great to meet you again. My question is somehow similar to the one that Babak raised. In order for us to be able to identify those difference in difference parameters, we really need to assume that the pre-pandemic trends were identical between these different provinces. And I wonder whether the pre-pandemic trend in, say, Tehran is, when I say Tehran, I mean the province of Tehran, is similar to, say, the example that I provided in my question, Markazi's province. And you may have done it in the paper, but in the presentation, I did not see any sort of examination of that. So I wonder whether or not you have done anything with that. Thank you.
Yes, Saleh, good to hear your voice. You are talking about this parallel trends assumption that underlines the difference in differences work. We didn't check that, partly because we have several treatment quarters, and I'm not sure, I've done something like this before when we had one treatment, and so the before and after was very clear, so we would look at the trends before. So there is some variation after, and there's probably some variation before. I can't say that we have satisfied a check on the parallel trends assumption. So that's a good point. I will look into that too.
Brilliant.
Oh, thank you so much for these questions. And let's move to the second paper, which is equally interesting. And
no, there's one more question. I'm just yeah.
Okay. Sure. We can cover that question and then move on to Ebad's paper. Sorry, what do you say?
Thank you, Talaya. Tali, thank you so much for this great presentation. And sorry, I have a very small question, and you may have, I joined late, so you may have covered it already. But were you, Mr. Saleh, were you just looking at labor force participation, or did you also look at employment and unemployment? Because what we know globally is when you have lower income levels, then there are more women available and interested in working, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are getting the jobs. So I was just interested to see if you're just looking at those trends of labor force participation or also following the employment patterns. Thank you.
That's a great question. Yes, we did look at employment as well. I was very curious whether participation is an entirely different decision that people make in Iran or women make in Iran compared to employment. The results are very similar I mean, that graph that I showed with a dropping participation of women after 2020 is virtually identical with the story on employment. So a lot of these declines in participation are actually declines in employment.
There is one quick question. One of the participants is asking, do we have any data on wage gaps? I think this is just in general, but perhaps not referring to your paper. If you could quickly answer that before we go to the next one.
That's also a very good question. The labor force survey does not have wages. The closest you get to or deeper into the employment decision phenomena is hours worked. You have to go to the other data set, which is smaller. And I have not tried, since we had this richer labor force survey, did not go to the longitudinal data that exists on income and expenditures. But there we do have the wages. The difficulty with wages is always that, women's wages are higher because only the more productive, more educated participate. So we can't quite learn a whole lot from the wage gap or the impact on the wage gap.
That's true. Well, let's move on to Ebad's paper, which is about some labor market reforms that have had also a negative impact on labor force participation rates of women. And with that, Ebad, over to you. Thank you. Thank you, Djavad, for your paper, for your presentation.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Nader. Thank you, Djavad. It was very interesting, exciting to hear the results of Javad's paper. I was hoping to have this presentation and these seminars in person so we can have more interaction, but due to circumstances, it's the second best, as Djavad said. So let me start this presentation. So in this paper, which I'm going to present, we studied the impact of the 2016 female labor reform in Iran. This is the paper co-authored by Professor Maggie Chen at George Washington University. And also a standard disclaimer applies, which is that the views expressed are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the views of the World Bank, its executive board, or the World Bank management. So let's start. So in this paper, we studied the impact of the 2016 female labor reform in Iran, which is also known as the Reduction of Office Hours Act for women with special circumstances. And I'm going to talk about these special circumstances in the following slides. What this reform was about is that women who are eligible to participate in this program, they work 8 hours less per week, but they get paid in full, meaning that based on the law, they shouldn't see any drop in their earnings. So the rationale behind it was that they work 8 hours less, so they have more time to do their household chores and spend more time with their family. And we use the Iranian household income and expenditure surveys. As Djavad said, we have wages in this data set. So this is one of the main reasons that we want to use this data set over the labor force participation, the labor force survey, that we have the data also for that. The methodology that we use was difference estimations, and we studied the impact of this law. First, on targeted women, which is going to be the women who were eligible to participate in this program. And we saw that see a drop in working hours, which is something that this law and this reform want to happen. But on the other hand, we saw that there was a decrease in employment, which we call it as unintended consequences of this reform. We then move on to study the impact of this law and reform on the household expenditure. And we show that this reform had the impact on education expenditure, dropping it, which would have the long-term effect in development, especially for these targeted households. There is no need to honestly discuss extensively about the situation of women in Iran to this participant, to this group, and Djavad covered most of the ground, but I'm gonna just mention few remarks. Iran ranked third lowest with a score of 31.1 in the latest World Bank Women Business Law report. Only 2 other countries are below Iran in this rank. Also, Iran ranked 4th lowest in the Global Gender Gap Index for 2023, which shows the very dark situation, I would say, for women in the Iranian labor market, and also in terms of law for women in Iran, which needs to be improved significantly. To talk about the labor market, women's labor force participation rate is only 13% compared to 70% for men, which is much lower. And we saw that in Djavad's presentation, the huge gap between men and women labor force participation. Not only that, the unemployment rate is much higher for women. For women, it's 16% compared to 8% for men. So double of the unemployment rate for men in 2021. And this unemployment rate is higher for young women who are aged between 15 to 24 years. So it stands at 37%, which is very high, and it's higher than the average for women. For women with a college degree, it's higher and stands at 23%. So what it shows is that young women and women with a college degree, they have high unemployment rates. In this context, in 2016, the parliament passed the law known as what we call that law, the 2016 Female Labor Reform in Iran. The objective of the law was to reduce women's working hours from 44 hours to 36 hours without pay cuts. Now, who are going to be eligible to participate in this program? 3 groups of women. 1, female head of household. 2, mothers with children under the age of 6. And 3, women with disability and those who had sick family members in need of care. This reform was going back and forth between government, parliament, and the Guardian Council for about 10 years. And after 10 years, in September 2016, it was passed and enforced during the time of President Rouhani, it was enforced as well. So I'm not going to talk about this reform extensively because due to the interest of time, but I'm going to mention a few points in the reform, which is that it's in the reform, the burden of this policy, which is paying 8 hours that the women are not working, is on the shoulder of employers. And as I'm gonna talk about in the end, this is the part that I think that the policymakers needed to think carefully when imposing, like when enforcing this law, to avoid those unintended consequences. So data that we use in this paper is Iranian household income and expenditure survey from the first quarter of 2014 to last quarter of 2017. 26% of women in our sample are treated mothers, which is the mothers with a child less than 6 years old, and 4% are female head of households. Unfortunately, we don't have data on women with disabilities or those who have a sick family members, so we could not study the impact of this law on the third group of women who are eligible to participate in the program. The targeted households would be female-headed households, which they consist 11 to 14% of households in our sample, and households with mothers with a child less than 6 years old, which consists 26 to 30% of households. The methodology that we use is difference and difference estimation, which I'm going to show you the specification model shortly. But before that, this is the density of the working hours for women. So the top panel shows the density of the working hour for targeted women, which are mothers and female head of households. And you can see that pre-policy or after policy, we see the differences. So what we see here is that this density function shifted toward left post-policy, meaning that women work less hours. But for the other group of women, which are not those who are targeted, we see a slight shift toward right, meaning that they work longer hours instead. The specification model that we use to study the impact is basically this, which the law enforcing third quarter in 2016. So YIT is working hours, employment, and other labor market outcomes that we study in the paper for an individual I at quarter T. Treated women are mothers with a child less than 6 years old and female head of households. Policy T is a binary variable, which is 1 for quarters after the law was enforced. XIT is a time variant for variates. And we have province time and industry time fixed effect. The coefficient of interest is beta 1 that I'm going to show you in the regression tables that we have. And that shows the impact of the law basically on the labor market outcome. But the household income and expenditure surveys is a repeated cross-section. So we would have the selection bias or selection problem using this. And in order to address this issue, we basically construct pseudo panel data using the age of children and identifying mothers based on the year which they gave birth. And using that, we construct a cohort of mothers. So as you can see here, for example, mothers who gave birth in 2010, they're not eligible to participate in the program because the law was enforced in 2016. And in 2016, their child will be above 6 years old, which they're not eligible to participate. So any women who gave birth before 2010 would not be eligible to participate in the program, and we use them as a control group. However, for example, mothers who gave birth in 2011, only in 2016, they will be eligible to participate in the program, but they exit the program after that because their child would be over 6 years old. In 2012, it's going to be for 2 years, and we see basically how it goes. Using these pseudo panel data, this is another updated, if we can call it, a specification model that we change only the targeted women in the previous specification with the targeted mothers. which would be a dummy variable that indicates mothers if they're eligible to participate in the program or not. And the other part of this specification would be the same as the one that I showed you before. Now, showing the results, this is the first set of results, the effects of the reform on labor market outcomes. So as we can see in the top panel, mothers and female head of households, there's a reduction in their working hours, employment, which consists of formal and informal and formal and informal employment, and also formal employment and labor force participation. So we see that this reform had a negative impact on working hours, which was the effect that was desired based on this policy or law. But it also decreased employment, formal employment, and labor force participation. And when we use the second specification that we have, we see that, again, we see a drop in working hours and also for employment, showing that working hours drop, but also we have unintended consequences. Employment and formal employment drop as well. And doing kind of like a robustness check or a sanity check, we restrict the control group from the mothers cohort from 2006 to 2010 to only consider mothers who gave birth in 2008 up until 2010 to have a shorter and more similar group of mothers to those who are treated. And we see that the results are robust, showing the drop in working hours as well as employment and formal employment. So to give a summary of the main results of the paper, we see the reduction of working hours of targeted women by 0.9 to 1.5%, which is roughly equal to 34 minutes per week. And also we see the decrease in the employment by 0.2% to 0.3%. The drop in the working hours is not as much as it was in the law because of many reasons. One of the things is that women, in order to be eligible to get these benefits, they need to apply. It's a voluntary case. It's not mandatory. So this is one of the reasons that we see many women may not participate in the program. The other thing might be because they fear from losing their jobs, because they need to apply for a program to work 8 hours less per week, but they get paid in full. And many employers, they're not willing to do that, meaning that they pay someone who works 8 hours less for them. So this is because of that, employers responded to this reform by either replacing targeted female employees or they become less likely to hire this group of women. And this implied to the program's failure to safeguard the jobs of targeted female workers. So these results that I showed you was the results on targeted women. However, the reform also had an impact on childbearing age women, which is the spillover effect, meaning that if women, they are below 45 years old and they could basically give birth in the near future, then they would be susceptible to be participating in this program. And because of that, employers might not be willing to hire these group of women, or not, they're willing to basically not hire these groups. So what we see here, compared childbearing age women with the older women who are between 45 to 55 years old, we see that drop in their employment, but increase in the labor force participation, mainly because labor force participation is because of the age, but they could not find jobs. So it's not like resulting in finding a job for this group of women. Now, these are the event study plots showing that for the panel A, B, C are from table 1, showing that after the enforcing the law, working hours drop, earning drop 3/4 after the enforcement of the policy. However, it bounced back. So in the table, we see no statistically significant impact on earning. However, employment drop as well, and employment spillover effects, which is the impact on the employment for childbearing age women. Also, we see the drop in that case. But which group of women impacted the most? Due to the interest of time, I'm gonna quickly just mention that we see higher impact on women who were working in private sector, who had a college degree, or in non-agricultural sector. So these points out to the heterogeneous effects of the policy on a group of women. Regarding the gender gap, we studied the impact of this policy shock on childbearing age women who are women, as I said, below 45 years old, to the men who were also in the same age. And we saw that working hours for women decreased, their earning decreased, employment decreased, formal employment decreased, but not labor force participation. So we don't see any statistically significant results here. But what it shows is that due to this policy, it widened the gap, gender gap, so between men and women. And doing this in panel B for mothers less than 6 years old, which is the mothers who are eligible, compared to fathers, we see the drop in the formal employment as well. So what this slide shows is increasing the gender gap after the enforcement of this law. Now, the last set of results that I'm gonna show you is the impact on household expenditure. So by now, we saw that this reform decreased the employment for women. How it translates to expenditure of the households. To answer this question, we use the data on the household income and expenditure, and we show that the expenditure dropped. Net expenditure dropped for the targeted households, which would be the female head of household and also a household with those who has a child less than 6 years old. And the net expenditure dropped by 2.57%. And we see the drop significant and more in terms of expenditure on beverage and tobacco, education, restaurant and hotels. But expenditure on education is more importantly because it had long-standing and development impact for children in those households. In order to show these effects of this policy on the different groups of expenditure in the household, here is the picture which shows that these three dots that I'm pointing at, they are the beverage and tobacco, education, and restaurant hoteling, that we have the expenditure of these three categories drop significantly and statistically significantly. So what we see from this presentation is that there was a policy that it seems good, but at the end, it's reduced the job opportunities and labor market basically perspective for women. So that's why we call it good from far, far from good. It seems good, but it didn't have good results and it had unintended consequences. The problem was that employers, they bear the cost of this policy. So they refrain from hiring this group of women or they fired them as well. So in order to finish this presentation and talk about the root cause of this policy, here is a quote from the book of Shirin Ebadi, the Nobel Peace Prize winner in 2003, and the lawyer, which is this text coming from women's rights in the laws of the Islamic Republic of Iran, which says that the Iranian labor legislation aims to improve the working condition of women who have dual responsibility at home and in the workplace. This is achieved by providing them with benefits such as maternity leave and establishing childcare facilities in the workplace. While these benefits are essential, they can also have unintended consequences. The costs associated with implementing these policies are often passed to employers, which can discourage them from hiring women. As a result, the very law that was intended to support women can actually hinder their participation in the labor market and push them towards informal employment. Thank you. Over to you, Nadereh.
Very much reading both this paper as well as Djavad's paper, which sort of like seem to be complementing each other quite a bit. I fully agree that, there are lots of unintended consequences of well-intended policies. But what surprises me is that there is a lot of evidence, cross-country evidence in all other countries, which precisely have long spans and longitudinal studies that precisely show that when the private sector has to shoulder any cost, it will certainly not work. It will certainly have negative consequences, and I'm surprised that these policies did make it through without really looking at the experience of other countries. Are there some questions? Would you please put your questions in the line? Okay. Samirjan, do you want to ask people?
Yeah, they have right to speak. So yes, anybody who wants to ask.
Madam Chair, please, if you could please ask your question, that would be great. Is Madam Chair there, or should I ask the question?
Yes, can you hear me now? I do apologize, I did not unmute. Yes. Well, my question is obvious, I think, that whether this law were to be implemented, which had unintended consequences or otherwise, this is a global challenge that women have because there is a possibility of bearing children and less working hours that the employers are liable to keep them unemployment and pay and so on. So this is a global problem that the employers prefer to employ women, men rather than women. And so, which is the subject of everybody who is in the panel and others who studied. So I thank Dr. Ebadi for quantifying this particular example in the case of Iran. That was my observation. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Tabrizi, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Ebad, this is a puzzling finding. Thank you. I'm thinking about the channels, and I first thought about this distinction between public state-sponsored services in education and health versus private, and you had examined that, which is great. This is in line with what I expected. The effect is much more pronounced in private sector as opposed to state-sponsored education and health organizations and so on. However, I wonder if there are any impacts on childbearing among those who have been treated when you compare it with those who are in your control group. So having this particular policy in place, someone who is now enjoying the benefits of it may go ahead and make other decisions over childbearing, which then in turn can affect their employment status and the outcomes that you study. So that would remain unexplored, and I think you should take a look at it. Thank you.
Okay. Do you want to should I? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, or collect question and then answer. I don't know which.
Go ahead, because it's better to address them.
Okay. So first, thanks a lot, Madam Chair. That was, you're right. This is it is not the problem that is specific to the Iran's case. So it's a problem that in other places, and there are multiple papers on the maternity leave that shows that, or family-friendly policies that also shows these unintended consequences. You're right, but what is important is to think about these things in the context of the basically policy and see how we can avoid these unintended consequences. But this is not the problem that's specific about Iran. It's a global problem, as you said. In terms of channels, so if I get your question correctly, Saleh, it's basically what you're asking is to compare the same result, doing the same analysis from the targeted women as a treated group, which are the mothers with a child less than 6 years old, let's say, and the childbearing women as a control group, right? This is what you suggested, basically?
No. So imagine
okay,
the estimations that you have, and you make a comparison between private and public employment status, and that reveals a potential channel there, right? Now, I'm asking whether or not this policy alone has had any impact on childbearing decision of those who have been treated.
Okay, fertility.
Right? Yes.
So, yeah.
So that sort of
thing. We can test this. So I did it, but I don't have it in the presentation. I did it a long time ago, not with this specification but we didn't find like statistically significant impact, but it's good to have it. I'm gonna include it in the result. Thanks. But I doubted that it had the impact on fertility rates, but it's something that we can definitely look into it. Thanks.
You bet.
But it is actually, I think the purpose of the policy, if I recall it correctly, was in fact to make it easier for women to have children and not to worry about how to take care of the children. So the objective was to have a positive impact on fertility, even though it didn't achieve. It doesn't seem to.
Yeah, but it's other factors like the economic factors that might play a bigger role. So in that case, this reform might not be, the impact of it might not be statistically significant. So it would be interesting to see it with the updated specification that we have, because we did it with the previous specification, but it should be done with the updated one.
Yeah.
Definitely. Thanks.
Okay. We have. Do you have a follow-up question? Okay. Mr. Jamwani? No. Could we go to the next question, Mr. Janshahi, if you would like to ask your question? Do you have the mic?
Well, I wanted you to talk if you wanted to.
There are two hand raised as well.
Yes. Okay. Well, then let me go to Mohammed, who has raised his hand, and then I come back to Mr. Janbani, maybe Janshahi in the afterwards. Mohammed.
Yeah, I have a question to Djavad. At the beginning of the presentation, when he was comparing the women life, female labor force participation during the years of pandemic, he was suggesting that Iran experienced an economic growth, except for 2020. So we had some positive growth rate in the years of pandemic. And it was expected that the female labor participation to increase, but it remained low and even decreased. So that was a puzzling. And then at the same time, during the sanction, he showed in the figure that the income reduced as a result of probably reduction of income. It motivated the household and the women in the household to search for a job, and that could predict this increase in the female labor participation. So my question is how we should read this, and how we should basically understand the response of female labor participation to changes in income. Do we expect an increase in income should result to higher female labor participation? If this is true, why you expect that the reduction of income on the sanction can explain the increase in the female labor participation during the sanction? That was not very clear to me. And the question to about the statistical significance of your result with a sample of maybe 50,000 observation, do you think is it still good idea to show and highlight the significance on 10% level, or should we speak and stick to the higher level of confidence interval with such a big number of observation? Thank you.
Should I answer?
Go Djavad first. Yes, go ahead, Djavad.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, that's a very good question, Mohammed. But as you know, our study wasn't about that. It was about income effect on women's labor force participation. I just made that remark to encourage us to think about sanctions and COVID in different terms. They're not both the same because COVID directly affects employment, whereas sanctions affects employment indirectly. And in that indirect effect, I speculated, which is a very reasonable economic argument, that if incomes go down for whatever reason, people, for example, if the income from other sources, like whatever you get from the oil rent, if that goes down, then you may try to supplement that with labor income. So employment becomes more desirable. But that is subject of a different study. So I don't have any evidence on it. I just thought it was good to think in those terms at the difference between sanctions and COVID.
Ebad, would you like to comment on Mohammad's question?
Sure. Thank you so much, Mohammed. Great suggestions. So the reason that some of the results you write are significant 1% significance level, but some of them are at the 10%, especially the working hours. And the reason that we want to show it is basically it's because these are the important thing for the narrative of the paper. And actually we want to see that the policy reduce the working hours. So I would say this is the selection of the basically labor market outcomes that we put, and some of them is actually not significant at all, like earnings, but we wanted to just have it there to show that it didn't have the impact. So usually in like academic papers, you're right, we only show significant result, but also I think there's a story to tell even for insignificant, statistically insignificant result that we have, especially for earning in here. But this is something that we can, basically, I would be happy to have a separate conversation with you in order to how to make it more, these results more compelling in a start.
Okay. And I go next to Hashem. Would you like to ask your question, please? Hashem Pesaran, Professor Pesaran.
Well, thanks so much. It's not my area, but I was really puzzled by the model. I have so much data, and there are lots of heterogeneity. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to interpret these results because there are many different provinces, different industries. So putting a dummy doesn't cover the heterogeneity because it's the problem of impact, not a shift. Because policy is a change of behavior. It's not just a shift in the level. So given the data, I think it's related also indirectly to the question Mohammed raised about the level of significance. That usually, my experience is that unless you show that, for example, for a particular industry in a particular province and what happens, because you have enough data. So why not just present more disaggregated result? What is the point of pooling? I know all people do. It's not a criticism of you. I mean, my view of the whole profession. I think they exaggerate the evidence. Usually, when you pool, standards go down. I mean, in a way, what Mohammed is worried about that you don't have enough theory. In fact, my experience that standards will go down, the more homogeneity you impose, and therefore you get a wrong impression that you got to find something. Anyway, this is a general comment, and I couldn't understand how dealing with what you call in province, industry. I mean, it's very difficult because you can interact them, so there would be multiple of them. So you could be. So I didn't get the model properly, maybe. The way I would say, if you look at equation 2, I actually looked at your paper, you really need to put the J and the P for both sides, the J being the, I think, industry and the P the province, because you have to identify whether that individual woman belongs to a particular sector, a particular province, and a particular industry. You can't have the left-hand side have no J and P and have it on the right-hand side. for example. As soon as you do that, then it just shows that, look, there's so much heterogeneity. I mean, look at Khuzestan as compared to Tehran. Tehran dominates the, we saw the results of the results. So in Iran, it's really pooling is not allowed in my view. I mean, it's not allowed in the US, it's not allowed in many countries. I mean, in Iran, definitely not allowed. So therefore, if you want to be convincing the reader, I would recommend taking a more disaggregated approach. If you don't have data, admit you don't know, just do it for a few provinces and you have enough data, or industries that you have enough data. Then that would be convincing more than just looking at the one regression. Anyway, sorry, I mean, I didn't want to. It's not a criticism of the work. I'm sorry, you're doing a great job, all of you. That's very important. My concern is that we don't want to have a result which is doubtful.
No, excellent suggestion. Like actually, after your question, I mean comments, I better understand Muhammad's point as well. So definitely, it's possible to do this, like doing, I guess it goes to seeing the heterogeneous impacts of the result based on provinces. But what we did when we pulled this over basically at the country level was basically we used the fixed effects. So province, industry time, and actually interaction of the province time, fixed effects, and industry time, fixed effects. And the rationale behind it is that many things can change during this let's say at the industry and time level, right? So capturing those unobserved factors using fixed effects. And if anything happens, let's say they're during the time for each province, our fixed effects will capture that, basically changes. But I guess it goes more to see on a granular level, heterogeneous effect, for example, seeing that if this policy has more impact on Tehran, let's say, compared to Sistan, Baluchistan, it's very interesting to something quite honestly that I didn't think about.
Just to clarify, I mean, it's very straightforward what I'm saying. Allowing for fixed time effect or interaction in your equation does not take away from the fact that beta 1 and beta 2 is the same across everywhere, across all industries, across all provinces. So therefore, when you deal with fixed effect, does not deal with heterogeneity of effect.
Right.
So my concern is about what these beta 1 and beta 2 mean when you do these regressions. Now, the reason why people do it, they don't tell you, but they mean there is an average effect across the provinces. So what they say, oh, this beta 1 should have a J and a P on it, right? Because it's a sector, I mean, we don't say individual. We can't just say beta 1 depends on I, J, and a P, right? I give you that, right? So let's just say beta, nothing 1, is beta 1 is the J and a P index, right? Okay. Now then what people say now is pure random. There's the random and then I wash it off. So what I would then get the mean of this beta JP. My point here is, in the case of many parts of the world, these effects are not pure random across the country. It depends on institution, it depends on the language, depends on the culture, depends on so many factors. How could it be pure random, right? So therefore, because you're making, I didn't explain it maybe, your assumption in effect is heterogeneity pure random, if there is one.
Right.
It doesn't bother me. I mean, if I check any sample of the people, women in any part of the Iran, average the effect, I get the same if I take any sample from any other part of Iran. That's what you're saying. I say I don't buy it.
Yeah. No, good point. Very good point. Yeah. No, I mean, this is basically a standard way that it's in the literature, but you're right. You're right. No, I get your point.
People do it. I'm old enough to say what I think is the correct thing. It's like they say the emperor doesn't have the crown. You say that.
Yeah. No, but it's an amazing point. And I really want to see now to do it for provinces, because this is going to be very interesting to see at least, like, I mean, there's multiple ways to go with it, but you're right. It's the situation of women. We did it for urban rural, for all only, let's say, heterogeneous effects. So seeing how it's different, but your point is not heterogeneous, actually. It's a beta 1 that matters. So maybe most of this is
that's
coming
heterogeneity, but what I call
Yeah.
systematic heterogeneity.
Yes. Yeah.
Not pure random. Pure random is never is a problem. Averages work very well. The problem is that heterogeneity is not in a country like Iran in particular, pure random.
Right. No, it's a very good point. To be honest with you, I haven't thought about it before. So I need to think about it more, and maybe if it's okay to reach out to you and follow up with that.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah. So let's finish off with 2 more questions. The next one is by Fatemeh for Ebad, and then comes Salehi, and then we will wrap up. Fatemeh, are you online? Hello? Okay, otherwise, yes, she's here. Could you please ask your question?
Thank you so much for the presentation. Sorry, I missed part of it, but my question is, you mentioned that basically the unintended consequences of this seems good policy is really not good because women lose a chance of employment. My question is has 2 parts. One is, if the government, I don't know what is the policy now, if the government covers the cost of maternity leave, would that impact positively? And then the second is, basically, as you know, equal opportunity is ILO C-111 convention that Iran also is a signatory like so many other countries. How equal opportunity, gender equal opportunity can be respected while companies do not lose, not only do not lose benefit, but also gain because they don't want to lose talent of women, which is also, this is one of the indicators of Bloomberg's Gender Equality Index. Thank you.
And can I just quickly ask Salehi to also ask her question so that maybe there are some overlaps and you can ask. Salehi, I assume that your question is for Ebad, so please go ahead.
Yeah, Ebad, congratulations. This is really fascinating work. I don't have really a question, but more so a comment. I found it very interesting when you showed how household expenditure changes. So the global gender literature shows that when women generate income, they are more likely than men to spend it on the health and education of families. So I found it very interesting that you found something similar here, that with decreased incomes of these women, there's also less investment in the education. But what's even more interesting is how these sort of more vulnerable groups of women, right, female-headed households, that this theory applied even here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So Ebad, if you could answer Fatemeh's question, and then we'll wrap up.
Sure. Thank you so much, Salehi, for great comment. Thank you, Fatemeh, for excellent question. So quickly answer that. So there are 2 parts in the question. One part was that if a government covers the cost that was basically imposed on employers, what would happen? I mean, definitely it's gonna alleviate the problem to some extent, but to give you a definite answer, I cannot, to be honest, because this is something that we cannot see. It's a counterfactual. So academics talking about it, we need to run the test. We need to do, I don't know, counterfactual analysis. But from rationale behind this, I would say that it's basically reduce this problem, because then employers, they have not, like they're not, let's say, they're not, they would be willing, or if it's not willing, let's say, they're not gonna be prohibiting from hiring group of women, because then they don't have pay costs to it. So it should be fine. It should be nothing everything could stay the same, I think. But then again, we need to test it. We need to see if something like that happened, so we see the impact of it. Regarding the equal opportunity that you mentioned, I guess so. Let me first say that this problem of gender gap or inequality between men and women, it's a problem at the global scale, but it's much more in the case of Iran. And I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation about the Global Gender Gap Index and Women Business Law Report score that Iran is basically in the bottom 3 or 4 countries, which shows the huge gap that exists. But even in the US, there are tons of papers on the inequality between men and women. But this inequality is much more in the case of Iran. So even joining these convention, as you said, or these kind of like basically, I think you mentioned ILO. It by itself, it's not gonna help reducing this gap. There are many factors, other factors in play, which could be cultural, economic, but more importantly, law. So even joining that would not mean that they implement the law inside the country. There should be many laws tailored for Iran, for a specific context, many laws that should be implemented when they join it. It doesn't mean that they enforce it in the country. So these are other things that comes to discussion that I think Nadereh is better placed to answer this question honestly than me. So let me stop here.
Well, actually, this is an excellent comment that you made, that you know there's an ongoing debate about what works and what doesn't work. And I think that increasingly what we see in most countries is that they don't peg family care to women alone, but they peg it to parents. So parental leave, parental this, so that it's not always with the women who are being seen as being the ones that are being subsidized or so, but just families as a whole. And that men as well as women can benefit from some of these leaves. So most of these countries, including in the United States, more and more any kind of support to families is being branded as family leave, parental leave. And I think that's a way of bridging the gender gap. That is very important. We have had really fascinating conversations, and thank you all of you who have put some questions in. These are 2 topics, at least the topic of women's economic participation in Iran. One can write books and books and books about it and still have many things to talk about. So thank you for putting a stake in the ground on these 2 topics, and I hope that we can come back with additional thoughts that you may have, or additional follow-up research that you may have. And thank you for all of you who have put in some questions. Let me make a few announcements. This was, as I mentioned at the beginning, our last webinar this year. We have had a really great lineup of topics and speakers this year, and we hope that we will be continuing this onwards into 2025. Our next webinar will be on January 8th. I don't have the theme, the topic of it, but maybe Mohammed can quickly announce it. We look all very much forward to seeing you. Happy holidays. We have Yalda coming, of course, Christmas, and all of the, Hanukkah and all these others. So everybody is going to be in celebratory mood, and a great, great start of 2025. And don't forget to become members of IIEA. We really need you, and we really benefit from your insights and your contributions.
Nadereh, the topic on 8th of January, we have 2 presentations by Ali Mustafa and Muhammad Ali Mukhtari. Ali will talk about gasoline illegal trade in Iran, and Mukhtari will talk about the energy subsidy reform, the vital role of cash transfer, lessons from the largest subsidy reform in the developing world. So both papers are somehow related to energy subsidies and consequences of subsidies on Iran, which is a timely topic also. And we are looking forward for that. And I would like also to thank all the panelists today and the participants, and wish all the best for the coming year 2025. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you, Djavad.
Thank you all. See you in the new year.
Thank you.
See you next year.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.